Well, welcome to Chapter 10, Europe in the Middle Ages. There are 16 slides. So now we're going to look at Section 1, Peasants, Trade, and City of this chapter. New agriculture, more food, and peace in Europe allowed the population to double. Obviously, if you're eating well and you're not being killed, then you can double your population. People were able to cut forests and drain swamps to have more land to plant food. Iron was used to make plows called karuka. You can see the picture to the right of the man plowing. Entire villages would purchase one and use it as a group on each other's farm along with the horses. Peasants moved to a three-field system of planting, which also increased food production, allowing smaller portions of the land to lie fallow and allowed two-thirds to be planted. One field would lie fallow to regain fertility, the nutrients. The other two were planted, and but the old way was that half the field was planted and half the field would lie fallow, which means you lost 50%. In the new way, you only lost 33%. Now, the manorial system, which is based upon a manor, picture a big house and then people living around it. These actually eventually turned into little towns. A manor is an agricultural estate, a big house with lots of land. For safety and defense, people of the Middle Ages formed small communities around a central lord or master. Most people lived on a manor, which consisted of the castle or manor house, the church, the village, and the surrounding farmland. The free peasants were called serfs. If you could call them free, they were very much tied to the land, but they could leave. They didn't have that problem of being a slave. Their life was terrible, and though they had the basic freedom, their life was harsh and did not have much to live off of. They had to give the Lord part of their food that they grew, and they had to pay for the use of ponds, streams, and woodlands. Poaching was the idea of hunting without permission on the land of the Lord and could be punished even times by death. So here's an overall view of a medieval manor, and you could see the different pieces of the basic three-field system. You can see the church, the village, the pasture, the bakehouse, and then obviously this is how a town would grow up around this particular area. Makes perfect sense. So now what you're looking at is the still in section 1, it's basically the daily life of the peasants. And that wheel over there shows you what they did from 1 month to the next. If they didn't do it 1 month, it could affect them 6 months later. Obviously, if they didn't plant in 1 month, then, when they needed to eat, that food would not be there. So, the daily life of the peasants. The life of the peasants was simple. It changed according to the season. Harvest time was one of the busiest time. Extra animals would be slaughtered and the meat would be preserved by salting it, which draws out the fluids, kind of turning it into jerky. Grain would be made into bread. The peasant families, the wife did the cooking and baking. The peasants' diet consisted of breads, vegetables from their own gardens, dairy products from their own sheep, goats, and cows, and pork from their own livestock. Pantries were hung with birds and peasants, including swans, blackbirds, ducks, pigeons, rabbits, mutton, venison, and wild boar. Many of these animals were caught on hunts. So what we have here is the hierarchy of the system. And you can see it's represented in a triangle. And so who's at the top? The king. And you can see my Burger King looking guy to the right. Look, I'm on top, but I need the people below me. And he absolutely does, because he needs these people to keep control and to keep lawlessness. And he also needs the people at the bottom to do his basic farming and keeping of the land. Do notice at the very bottom that there is a man carrying a cross. So even the daily priests, which we'll look at a little later, had a very low level in this manorial system in medieval life. Okay, so you guys can use this for future reference as we move on to our next slide. So you can see that trade was important. Everybody wanted to share their stuff, sell it, make money, and move all over Europe and the Middle East, and then eventually to Asia. The revival of trade and growth of cities. Though medieval Europe was mostly agricultural, many cities began to grow as centers of trade connecting all parts of Europe and Asia. Trade fairs were created to encourage trade during specific times of the year. As cities grew, people began to have specific careers, or we called them trades. You can even see Tunis, Tripoli, Alexandria. Those are all in Africa. Eventually, this is bad because it does spread disease, specifically the Black Plague, but for now, it's a good thing. So the peasants' daily life, each manor was largely self-sufficient, growing or producing all of the basic items needed for food, clothing, and shelter. To meet these needs, the manor had buildings devoted to special purposes, such as the mill for the grinding of grain, the bakehouse for making bread, and the blacksmith shop for creating metal goods. If you go back to our picture 2 sheets ago, you would actually see this. There were high walls surrounding the city with not much space inside. The fear of fire was constant due to the wooden structure. There was also a problem with waste. Human and animal. There were buckets for excrement, which are poop and pee. It stunk. There was also pollution from fires. Water pollution was caused by human waste and slaughterhouses. So they would pee and poo inside the rivers, and then that kind of can give you all types of diseases, dysentery, using rivers to wash the meat and waste. There was more men than women. Why? Well, death and childbirth. Whether they were nobles or peasants, women held a difficult position in society. They were largely confined to household tasks such as cooking, baking, sewing, weaving, and spinning. Guilds, these are business associations of similar work. Craft guilds made things. There were bakers and carpenters. An apprentice was a 10-year-old that was sent to live with a master craftsman to learn a craft. Then a journeyman was a paid apprentice, and finally they become a master craftsman, the highest level, and they create a masterpiece. All right, we're on to section 2, Christianity and medieval civilization. The Catholic Church was the only church in Europe during the Middle Ages that was of the Christian faith, and it had its own laws and large income. Church leaders such as bishops, archbishops sat at the king's council and played leading roles in government. The papacy, which is the office of the Pope, the head of the Catholic Church during the Middle Ages, the Pope became more powerful than the kings in their day. Remember, he had spiritual authority, which sometimes is much more important than physical authority. Corruption was rampant with the power. Offices of the churches were sold to the highest bidder, and a token was given to show this power, known as lay investiture. Pope Gregory VII tried to end this. So imagine, and you guys can see some of the pictures to the right, imagine having that kind of power. These people weren't called into these positions through duty. They were actually sold. What are sacraments? Well, they were seen as a means of receiving God's grace and necessary for salvation. What is salvation, you ask? Deliverance from sin. Baptism, marriage, the Eucharist, which is communion, penance, reconciliation, confirmation, and holy orders are all examples of the sacraments of the Catholic Church. The church at this time was only Catholic, so that's all you're going to read about. The Reformation, for the birth of the Protestants, comes later in history. The people would pray to the saints, who were people that had lived a good earthly life and became saints according to the church. They would help people in this life. Relics were the bones or objects of the saints and were often worshipped as well. What is the Inquisition, you ask, and you look to the picture at the right? It's when the church wanted to discover who the heretics were, these are people that denied church teachings, and had the court deal with the people that distorted the church. Yet it became a distortion itself. Very frightening time. So I'm going to let you look at this. This is a summary of section 2. And what you're doing here is you're seeing the people of the church. You're seeing the bishops, the parish priests, the monasteries, the monks, and the nuns. And to be honest, the parish priests were the ones in that triangle that I told you actually lived quite a very simple life and little education. In the village, the priests tended to the sick and the indigent. And they were not very wealthy. The bishops, however, were, and this is where those positions would be sold. Now, you want to know what a monastery is and a convent? I don't have convent on there, but monastery is where the monks live, work, eat, breathe, and rewrite Bibles. They would actually handwrite and transcribe different chapters of the Bibles. And then nuns were the female counterparts to the monks. And they lived in convents, which you can see in there, and provided for the less fortunate members of the community. Quite often, women of questionable, of rich backgrounds were sent to convents to be raised in case they were doing questionable things in society. So that moves us to section 3, the culture of the High Middle Ages, where we get the first universities in where? A crazy place called Bologna, France. Women, of course, could not attend, but a group of men gathered to learn about Roman law. The students formed a guild and were given a charter, like Odyssey Charter School. This is how the university began. Students had to learn from lecture style due to book expense. Eventually, the University of Paris opened, and then many of these students and teachers left to begin Oxford University in England, which, by the way, you can still visit. So one of the things that's different is you would learn Latin, you would speak Latin, but there's vernacular language would be what you speak, like English or Italian or French. It's the language of the people. It's not formal. Latin was typically used across other languages to form of communication, like in science. When you use genus species names, those are in Latin so that people in Italy can understand what animal we're talking about. But vernacular would be the language that's spoken. And you can see some of the examples of those languages in that picture. Canterbury Tales, for example. So now we're on the second slide for section 3, and I just want you to see some of the beautiful architecture. Early Christian, Romanesque, and Gothic. And Gothic is usually the one where everybody sees the flying buttresses allowed the architects create a feeling of upward movement in Gothic cathedrals. Higher ceilings, all of the physics of the weight of a building coming down on the walls, which is, and these walls were typically made of wood and then made of stone, are why architecture is so important at this time and how those changes are made. Well, here's the architecture of a peasant house, very different than what we just saw. You can see that grass on the top is called thatch. And if you've ever met somebody with the last name Thatcher, their job was to repair those roofs. You can see the life on the inside. Most medieval homes were cold, damp, and dark. Sometimes it's very difficult to put windows into these structures. It creates a weakness, and it also creates a gap where cold weather can come in. So windows weren't necessarily a part of their architecture. Okay, we are on section 4, which is the last section. And so what you guys will see in here is Black Plague. Please Google it. See the different pictures of what happens to the body when you get the plague. There are different types of plagues, and you can see that this is the one we're talking about. Look how it came out of the Middle East in Constantinople area from the Middle East, and then it moved west. And then according to those dates, then it went north. Medicine was a risky business. Bloodletting was a popular method of restoring a patient's health, and humors, bloodletting is literally taking your blood. Early surgery, often done by barbers without anesthesia, must have been excruciating. Medical treatment was available mainly to the wealthy, and those living in villages rarely had the help of doctors who practiced mostly in the cities and courts. Remedies were often herbal in nature, but also included earthworms, urine, and animal excrement, which we all know doesn't help anymore. Many medieval medical manuscripts contained recipes for remedies that called for hundreds of therapeutic substances. The notion that every substance in nature helps some other power accounts for the enormous variety of substances. I can't say I don't deny that, but at the same time, excrement, Black Death, the plague, the bubonic plague. People did not know what caused the plague and blamed each other's, like the Jews. It really came from a flea on the rats. This is also called anti-Semitism. When people actually blame the Jews because something else was happening, that's what anti-Semitism is. People were afraid to gather and to travel. So remember all of that traveling that people were doing to encourage the economy and the growth? That stopped. I think if you kind of think of this compared to Ebola and what you're seeing right now, that might be a great way of looking at it. So on this slide, with the plague, you can see that there are the bubonic plague, the symptomatic plague, and the pneumonic plague. So you can see just some of the images that come from the plague. So during the late Middle Ages, aside from the plague killing people and stopping them from gathering together, there was also something called a 100 Years' War. Now, the reason why this is so slow is because they might be fighting about the same issue, but they can't just fight, have a battle, and decide who wins and then end it. It just kept kind of going on and going on. So you could see that the war is the Edwardian War, the Caroline War, and the Lancastrian War. And the final battle is the Battle of Castilian. So you could see that this just went on for a very long time. It was a series of conflicts waged from 1337 to 1453 between the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of France. Basic to know who the who the 100 Years' War was fought between, France and England. It was a result of a dynastic disagreement dating back to William the Conqueror. That's dynastic, means who's the king and who's going to be the king. Okay. So you guys can see this. I know there's a lot of reading there, so we're going to go on to the next slide. And please feel free to download the PowerPoint presentation and read it more closely. What we have here is in the late Middle Ages. This is the final slide, and it talks about Joan of Arc because she was a part of the 100 Years' War. And she was a folk heroine and of France, and a Roman Catholic saint. She was born a peasant girl in what is now eastern France. Claiming divine guidance, she led the French army to several important victories during the 100 Years' War. She was captured by the Burgundians, transferred to England in exchange for money, put on trial by the pro-English bishop, and then she was put to death by burning. Hopefully she was able to actually die of smoke inhalation instead, but she was only 19 years old. So notice this. I am gunpowder, and I am the reason the French won the war in 1453. Yes. Well, I hope you guys have enjoyed that. Thank you very much.